He preached peace. They called him a threat. He inspired millions, and the FBI tried to destroy him. This is the story they tried to bury. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia in the year 1929. He was the son of a Baptist preacher, raised in the segregated South, raised in a world that taught black children to be quiet, to be careful, to stay in their place. But Martin didn't stay quiet. He spoke, softly at first, then louder, then to the world. By the time he was 26 years old, he was leading one of the most important boycotts in American history, the Montgomery bus boycott. It wasn't just about riding the bus. It was about dignity, about power, about saying no more. King's weapon was not violence. It was voice. He called for peace. He called for courage. And America listened. By the early 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just a preacher from Georgia. He had become the face of the civil rights movement. He marched on Washington. He faced jail time. He was stabbed, threatened, and attacked. But he kept going. On August 28, 1963, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he gave a speech that would echo across time. "I have a dream." Those 4 words changed the course of history. They were not angry. They were not loud. They were calm, measured, and unforgettable. He spoke of children holding hands, of justice rolling down like water, of a future where a man would be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. Over 250,000 people stood before him. Millions more watched on television. The world took notice, and so did the government. What many didn't know, not then, not during the speech, not even years later, was that someone else was listening, not with applause, not with hope, with microphones, with tape recorders, with fear. Behind the cheers, behind the dream, behind the man with the voice, there were men in suits, sitting in quiet offices in Washington, D.C., taking notes. They were agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And to them, Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a preacher, not just a leader, he was a threat. The idea that a black man could inspire millions terrified them. The idea that a peaceful protest could move more hearts than 100 speeches from the White House, it shook them. To many in power, King's dream sounded a little too dangerous, a little too radical, a little too revolutionary. He was loved by the people, but feared by the system, because his words did not just comfort the oppressed, they challenged the powerful. And so, while Martin marched through the streets, while he met with presidents and ministers, while he received honors and death threats in the same week, others were watching. They bugged his phones, they monitored his meetings, they recorded his hotel rooms. Martin Luther King Jr. was being watched by his own government, not for breaking laws, not for inciting violence, but for dreaming too boldly. That dream would cost him, but not yet. In this moment, in 1963, Martin stood tall, calm, unshaken. He was no longer just a preacher. He was a movement, a message, a mirror, a man who forced America to see itself and decide who it wanted to be. And in the distance, as the crowd cheered and the sun set over the National Mall, a reel-to-reel tape spun quietly in an FBI field office, recording the sound of a dream. J. Edgar Hoover was one of the most powerful men in American history, and one of the most feared. He had been the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since the year 1924. He served under 8 presidents. He outlasted scandals, elections, wars. No one, not Congress, not the courts, not even the White House, dared to challenge him. To the public, he was a patriot, a guardian, a man who protected the country from spies, gangsters, and subversives. But behind the clean suits and sharp haircuts, Hoover built something else, a secret empire, an empire of files, favors, and fear. He kept records on everyone, politicians, journalists, actors, even presidents. He used that information not just for justice, but for leverage. And in the early 1960s, one name appeared more and more often in his crosshairs: Martin Luther King Jr. To Hoover, King wasn't just a rising figure. He was a threat to the American way of life. Hoover believed that the civil rights movement, if left unchecked, would lead to instability, racial violence, and even revolution. He saw protests not as peaceful demands for justice, but as organized chaos. And he was convinced that behind King's message of love and nonviolence was something far more sinister. In Hoover's mind, communism was everywhere. In books, in universities, in labor unions. And now he feared it was inside the civil rights movement. He believed that King was being influenced or even controlled by communist sympathizers. There was no real evidence, no proof. But for Hoover, suspicion was enough. And once suspicion took root, the war began. In 1962, the FBI launched COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Its official mission was to surveil and disrupt groups seen as subversive. But in practice, it became a tool for political warfare. King became one of its top targets. Agents were ordered to dig into every part of his life: his associates, his travel, his finances, his private behavior. Nothing was off limits. They bugged his hotel rooms, they tapped his phones, they followed his friends, they even tried to infiltrate his inner circle, recruiting informants who could report back to Hoover. The Bureau compiled hundreds of pages on King, memos, field reports, personal details, and slowly, the mission shifted from surveillance to sabotage. Hoover didn't just want to watch King. He wanted to destroy him, to discredit him, to break his spirit. FBI agents leaked false rumors to the press. They tried to ruin his reputation among church leaders and politicians. They sent anonymous letters to black newspapers, accusing King of betrayal and immorality. One memo from Hoover's office stated clearly, "We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro in the future of this nation." The irony was staggering. A man preaching peace, being treated like an enemy of the state, a man walking unarmed into hostile towns, being followed by federal agents, a man asking for dignity, being threatened by those sworn to uphold the law. And yet, King knew. He suspected early on that he was being watched, that rooms felt too quiet, that phone clicks weren't imagined, that eyes followed him, even in the dark, but he refused to back down. "We will meet your physical force with soul force," he once said, and he meant it. Even as the government tried to destroy him from within, he kept walking forward. But Hoover was not finished. He ordered his agents to create tension between King and other civil rights leaders, to feed divisions, to plant doubts. He feared King's growing influence, his ability to unite not just black Americans, but poor people across racial lines, workers, veterans, students. Hoover feared King's dream because it gave people hope, and people with hope can't be controlled. By 1964, the FBI's obsession reached its peak. That year, King won the Nobel Peace Prize. Most of the world applauded, but in Washington, Hoover seethed. Within weeks, King received a package. Inside, a tape secretly recorded in his hotel room and an anonymous letter. The message was clear: step down or be destroyed. The letter ended with a chilling line: "There is only one way out for you." King understood the threat. He was not only under surveillance, he was under attack from his own government. J. Edgar Hoover believed he was protecting America. But in his crusade against Martin Luther King Jr., he crossed a line between safety and suppression, between justice and fear. History would judge Hoover's actions harshly, but in the moment, he acted without shame. And as King continued to rise, the man in the FBI tower watched, plotted, and waited. Because for Hoover, this wasn't oversight, it was war. The surveillance didn't start loud, it started quietly, discreetly. A phone call here, a hotel stay there, one microphone, then two, then more. In the early 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr.'s name was added to a growing list of individuals the FBI considered persons of interest. But unlike the average case file, King's surveillance wasn't just about national security. It was personal, deeply personal. The Bureau didn't just monitor his speeches, they monitored his phone calls to his wife. They recorded conversations with his advisors. They tracked his travel, took photos of his hotel guests, noted who came and went, who spoke to him, who lingered in lobbies too long. Agents followed him across cities. They booked rooms in nearby hotels. They tapped into switchboards and called janitors for access. They even tried to bribe bellhops. If King breathed, the FBI wanted to hear it. They placed recording devices in his rooms while he was at events. They rifled through his mail. They listened to private moments that had nothing to do with the civil rights movement, nothing to do with communism, nothing to do with national security. The files they compiled weren't policy briefs. They were character assassinations waiting to happen. Hundreds of pages detailed not his strategy, but his flaws, not his vision, but his voice in unguarded hours. Some tapes included his jokes, his laughter, his fatigue. Others, more intimate, were intended to embarrass, to shame, to hurt. They labeled the files with cold clinical names, internal memoranda, audio transcripts, behavioral reports. But the truth was simpler. They were building a weapon, one they hoped to use not in court, but in public. Because the FBI wasn't preparing for an arrest. They were preparing for exposure. They believed if the American people saw King not as a leader, but as a flawed man, they would turn on him. They believed that scandal would do what politics couldn't: silence him. This wasn't law enforcement. This was psychological warfare. Inside the Bureau, agents shared summaries of what they called derogatory material. They categorized it. They rated it. They shared it with select figures in government, in media, in the church. Quietly, carefully, always off the record. But the goal was clear: destroy his image, break his spirit, strip away his moral authority. Martin Luther King Jr. was not perfect, and the FBI wanted the world to know it, or rather, to believe only that. They feared his words, so they amplified his weaknesses. They feared his vision, so they magnified his faults. They feared his rising popularity, so they tried to pull him down with tape and ink. What makes this story more disturbing is not just the surveillance itself, but how far the government was willing to go. FBI memos show that agents were encouraged to gather evidence of infidelity, not to prosecute, but to manipulate, not to report, but to leak. They planned to use it against him in public and in private, to divide him from his supporters, to isolate him from his allies, to pressure him into silence. And they didn't stop at gathering data. They escalated. One document described strategies to neutralize King as a civil rights figure. That was the word they used: neutralize. Not investigate, not observe, neutralize. The implication was clear. They wanted to remove his influence, remove his reach, remove his ability to inspire. And if they couldn't do it legally, they would do it socially, emotionally, even spiritually. By 1964, the operation had expanded. Entire teams were dedicated to monitoring him. Weekly summaries were circulated. New bugging equipment was requested. The surveillance became routine, normal. Just another file to update. Some FBI staff began to question it, quietly, carefully. But dissent was dangerous under Hoover, and loyalty to the director often came before loyalty to justice. King, meanwhile, pressed forward. He continued to march, to organize, to speak. But he knew. He could feel the eyes. He could sense the tension. He began to find hidden microphones. He noticed that friends were becoming distant. He felt the pressure. Not just from racists and politicians, but from invisible forces he couldn't name aloud. He spoke about it in sermons, indirectly. He hinted at it in interviews. He never shouted it, never named it. But he knew. And still, he marched. Because for King, the dream was more important than the fear. The vision was more powerful than the threat. The cause was bigger than the cost. The FBI thought it could break him, but it never understood him. They studied his movements, but not his message. They recorded his voice, but never heard his heart. They reduced him to a target and missed the man. And while their tapes spun in hidden rooms, while their files grew thicker and colder, Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of thousands again and again and said, "We will not hate you. We will not stop. We will overcome." And no microphone, hidden or not, could silence that. In the autumn of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. was at the height of his public influence. That year, he had led new marches, gained international acclaim, and most notably, been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was 35 years old, the youngest person ever to receive the honor. But just weeks after the world praised his message of nonviolence and dignity, he received something else, something cold, something cruel. A small package arrived at his home. Inside was a cassette tape recorded without his knowledge. Alongside it was a letter, typed, anonymous, unsigned. It began with flattery, then threats. Then, finally, a suggestion, cloaked in the voice of supposed concern. The message was unmistakable. You are a fraud. You are a disgrace. And you should take your own life before the truth comes out. There is only one way out for you, it warned. King knew instantly what it was. He knew the FBI had been watching him. He knew about the surveillance, the whispers, the shadows. But this was different. This wasn't surveillance. It was a psychological weapon delivered like a gift. The Bureau had crossed a line. The recording was made during one of King's hotel stays, a private moment, captured illegally, meant to shame and degrade him. The letter accused him of moral corruption, of being unworthy of leadership. It warned that if he didn't resign and disappear, the contents of the tape would be made public. But beneath the accusations was something darker, a tone that felt more like a trap than a warning. The implication was clear. Kill yourself, before we kill your legacy. It was signed by no one, but it carried the fingerprints of the state. Years later, when internal FBI documents were declassified, the truth became undeniable. The letter had been written by FBI agents, approved by supervisors, and delivered with intent. Not just to intimidate, but to psychologically corner a man until he believed there was no way out. This wasn't about national security. This was about character assassination. This was an official attempt to emotionally destroy a citizen who dared to challenge the status quo. J. Edgar Hoover and his inner circle believed that if they couldn't stop King with facts, they would stop him with fear. But King didn't break. He read the letter, he heard the tape, and then he handed it to his closest advisors and attorneys. He did not run, he did not flinch, he did what he always did. He kept moving forward. But it shook him. Privately, King was deeply disturbed. He confided to those around him that he felt as though a great machine had turned against him. Not just individuals, but institutions. And yet, he never allowed that fear to guide his actions. Publicly, he never acknowledged the letter. He never gave the FBI the satisfaction of a reaction. No press conferences, no public outrage, just silence. The kind that infuriates those who want to provoke. He turned instead to his work, to organizing, to marching, to speaking. But the letter marked a turning point, not just for King, but for the nature of the U.S. government's war against dissent. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about what the government was willing to do to protect the illusion of order. Because if they could send this to Martin Luther King Jr., a Nobel laureate, a minister, a symbol of peace, what would stop them from doing it to anyone? The letter revealed something Hoover never intended to show: fear. The FBI feared King's voice so much that it was willing to abandon every ethical and legal boundary to silence it. They wanted him broken. But instead, they revealed their own weakness. The letter survives today in the National Archives. The original tape, too. Not as tools of shame, but as evidence. Evidence of how far power can go when it believes no one is watching. Martin Luther King never gave in to the darkness inside that envelope. He saw it for what it was: a bluff wrapped in cruelty. A desperate act by a powerful agency that had lost control of its mission. And like every other threat he faced, he met it with quiet strength. No microphone recorded his first reaction. No camera captured his face when he opened that package. But history remembers how he answered. He lived, he marched, he spoke, and he won. Not just because of what he believed, but because he refused to be broken. Not by dogs, not by bullets, and not by anonymous letters signed by fear. In October of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. received a phone call that would change his life. Again. The voice on the other end spoke calmly, formally. It was from Oslo, Norway. The Nobel Committee had reached a decision. Martin Luther King Jr. would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was 35 years old, the youngest person ever to receive the honor at the time. He joined the ranks of global figures, men and women who had stood against oppression and violence with words, not weapons. The world took notice. Across Europe, King's name became a symbol not just of civil rights, but of moral courage. Newspapers praised his discipline. Diplomats applauded his message. Universities extended invitations. The international press portrayed him not as a radical, but as a reconciler, a healer of nations. But back home, the reaction was different. In some quarters, his win was welcomed. There were headlines, yes. Some polite congratulations from Washington. But under the surface, beneath the official words, something darker stirred. To many in power, King's prize was not a celebration. It was a threat. They did not want a Nobel laureate with a protest sign. They did not want a global figure pointing a mirror at America's unfinished promises. They did not want his voice amplified, so they tried to lower it. Behind closed doors, pressure intensified. At the FBI, agents worked harder than ever. If the world now saw King as a saint, the Bureau wanted to prove otherwise. They redoubled their efforts. Surveillance increased. The flow of rumors expanded. New memos were drafted. More recordings were made. King's movements were tracked with military precision. His hotel rooms were still being bugged. His conversations still recorded. And now, those private materials began to leak. Anonymous tips were sent to journalists. Unverified claims made their way into local papers. Allegations about his private life, carefully selected, strategically timed, began to surface. No arrests, no trials, just suggestion, no evidence, just doubt. This was Hoover's strategy, not to confront, but to corrode, erode trust, erode faith, erode the clean image the world now held. And it wasn't just the FBI. Some politicians, too, began to shift. They didn't oppose King publicly, but they stopped inviting him. They stopped quoting him. They referred to him as controversial, unstable, polarizing. The very man who had spoken of peace in Washington now faced silence in the Capitol. Journalists started asking different questions. Less about policy, more about personal conduct. Less about civil rights, more about rumors. More about distractions. King could feel it. The weight, the pressure. The higher he rose, the thinner the air became. He was no longer seen as just an American preacher. He was now a global conscience. And that made some people uncomfortable. They didn't want him shamed. They wanted him doubted. They couldn't deny his speeches, so they questioned his sincerity. They couldn't disprove his facts, so they attacked his character. And King, already carrying the burden of a movement, now carried something heavier: betrayal. He had allies. He had friends. But in this moment, he also had silence from those who should have stood by him. Some feared association. Some believed the rumors. Some simply wanted distance from a man the government clearly wanted gone. He accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo with grace and dignity. His speech spoke of nonviolence, of hope, of a world yet to be. He spoke softly, but his words were powerful. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. The world heard those words and stood in ovation. But back in America, the Bureau was already working on its next file. And still, King pressed on. He returned to the United States and immediately resumed organizing, planning, speaking. There was no break, no celebration, because King knew something few others did. The prize didn't make him safe. It made him a bigger target. Hoover saw that gold medal as a golden opportunity to bring King down from the inside out. This was no longer about ideology. This was personal. King didn't ask to be worshipped. He asked to be heard. But now every word he spoke was shadowed by whispers. Every step followed by agents. Every ally approached by rumors. He stood on the mountaintop of world recognition and realized that at home, the rocks were already being thrown uphill. But he didn't stumble. He walked forward because he knew the truth. The prize wasn't his protection. It was his responsibility, and he would carry it, even under the weight of lies, even through the storm of surveillance. He had won peace, but the war against him was only growing louder. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, the world went quiet. For a moment. Then it exploded. Cities burned, streets filled with grief. Millions mourned, not just the man, but the dream he carried. A dream they feared had died with him. In the days that followed, news anchors called him a martyr. Politicians, some of whom had ignored or even criticized him in life, now praised his message in death. Memorials were held, boulevards renamed, speeches rewritten. But something was missing. The truth. For years, King's inner circle had suspected he was being followed, that he had been targeted, that somewhere someone had wanted him silenced, not debated. And then, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. In the 1970s, a Senate committee known as the Church Committee began investigating abuses of power within U.S. intelligence agencies. What they uncovered was staggering and chilling. Documents, memos, directives, all pointing to a coordinated effort by the FBI to surveil, smear, destabilize, and ultimately silence Martin Luther King Jr. It wasn't a few rogue agents. It was a sanctioned, organized, well-funded campaign, directed from the very top, led by J. Edgar Hoover himself. What had once been dismissed as paranoia now stood documented in cold black ink. The recordings, real. The letters, real. The plan to neutralize King, real. One internal memo stated plainly that King should be discredited both personally and publicly. Another detailed the anonymous letter sent to his home, the one that encouraged him to take his own life. This wasn't about crime. It wasn't about justice. It was about fear. The fear of a black man with a microphone, the fear of a nonviolent army marching toward change, the fear of a movement that refused to fight back the way the system expected. The FBI feared King because he didn't play their game. And when he wouldn't stop, they tried to stop him. Long after King's funeral, after the flags returned to full mast, after the cameras moved on, the records remained. The truth, though buried, would not stay silent. Declassified documents revealed the full extent of COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program designed to suppress political dissent in America. And at the top of that list, Martin Luther King Jr. The public was stunned, shocked, outraged, but some weren't surprised. They had lived it. They had watched the pressure. They had seen the surveillance vans. They had heard the static on the phone lines. For them, this wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. What made it more painful was the timing. King was dead, and those responsible for tormenting him would never face trial. There would be no justice, no apology, just files, and the damage they had done. Over time, more material came to light. King's FBI file eventually grew to thousands of pages, pages that documented not a threat to America, but an American the government couldn't control. And still, there was more. In the 1980s and 90s, civil rights historians pushed for further disclosures. By the 2000s, it became clear that a significant portion of the truth remained classified. Even today, not all the files have been made public. What are they hiding? Many believe the full extent of psychological warfare, especially the contents of surveillance tapes, would be too damaging to the reputations of institutions that still exist. Some fear that what's in those tapes could still be used to distort King's legacy. But here's the reality. The more they tried to erase his power, the more they proved it. The harder they worked to silence him, the louder his voice became. And the more they tried to destroy his dream, the more that dream refused to die. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered today not just because he marched or preached or dreamed, but because he endured. He endured pressure, surveillance, betrayal. He endured isolation, slander, and threats from the very nation he was trying to help. And still, he held the line. History remembers him as a visionary, as a leader, as a symbol of hope. But it must also remember this. Martin Luther King Jr. was hunted by his own government, not for violence, not for crime, but for peace. And the greatest tragedy of that truth is that it was hidden for so long. But today, the dream lives on. Not just because of what King stood for, but because the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always rises.